What if you found someone's missing diary and the last entry was just 3 terrifying words? They're already here? What if those pages revealed a gradual transformation from normal thoughts to absolute paranoia, documenting in real time the deterioration of someone's mind before they completely disappeared? Have you ever stopped to think about what you would do if you found something like that? If you had access to someone's most intimate thoughts in the days and weeks before they vanished without a trace, how would you interpret words that begin as completely rational and end in inexplicable fear? This diary exists, and what's written in it may never be fully understood. Stay with me until the end, because the case I'm going to tell you about today is one of the most disturbing disappearances I've ever studied, precisely because we have direct access to the person's final thoughts. But these thoughts raise more questions than they provide answers. What you're about to discover may surprise you and make you question everything you thought you knew about the fine line between sanity and paranoia, between real danger and imagined fear. Imagine picking up a regular notebook, the kind any college student uses to take notes, and finding completely mundane things on the first few pages. To-do lists, class summaries, reminders about exams and academic papers, random thoughts about the day, weekend plans. Pages that reveal a normal, functional person, dealing with the typical responsibilities of someone navigating college life. Nothing there raises alarms. Nothing suggests something is about to go terribly wrong. But then, as you turn the pages, something begins to change. Subtly at first, almost imperceptibly. A strange observation here. A comment about feeling watched there. You could easily gloss over these details, interpreting them as momentary paranoia we all experience at times. Who hasn't felt that feeling of being watched, even for no objective reason? Who hasn't had that moment of inexplicable discomfort that later passes, and you completely forget? But in this student's case, the feeling didn't go away. It grew, intensified, took over each subsequent page until the diary entries were no longer about classes or friends or future plans. They were about them. Who were them? The diary never fully clarifies. There are vague references to people watching, following, knowing things they shouldn't have. There are mentions of patterns only the student could see, connections that made sense only to him. And then on the last page with anything written, just 3 words in hurried, almost desperate handwriting. They're already here. After that, blank pages. And after those blank pages, a disappearance that remains unsolved to this day. The student simply vanished, leaving behind only that diary as the only window into what had been going on in his mind over the previous weeks. The impact of reading these pages is profound and disturbing, because you are literally witnessing someone's transformation in real time, documented by their own hand. These aren't secondhand accounts from friends telling you he was acting strange. These aren't retrospective analyses by psychologists trying to reconstruct his mental state. These are his words, his unfiltered thoughts, his growing worries, his fear escalating page after page until that final moment when he wrote those 3 words and then disappeared. Have you ever been there? Have you ever kept a journal documenting your most honest thoughts, your worries, your fears? Now imagine if those pages were the only thing left of you, the only evidence of what was going through your head before something terrible happened. How would people interpret your words? Would they understand the context, or would they just see paranoia and instability? This is precisely the dilemma the family and investigators face with this case. The diary exists as concrete evidence that something was happening to the student. But what was that something? Was it a genuine mental crisis, a psychological breakdown that led to irrational behavior and eventually disappearance? Or was it documentation of real danger, a legitimate threat he was trying to document in case something happened to him? The difference between these 2 interpretations is enormous, and the implications of each are completely different. If it was a mental health crisis, then the focus should be on hospitals, shelters, places where someone in a psychotic state might have gone. If it was real danger, then there's someone or something out there that caused a disappearance. And these pages are clues, not symptoms. But how do you determine which interpretation is correct when the only witness, the student himself, disappeared without leaving anything behind but these cryptic words? The case I'm going to tell you today forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about perception, reality, and fragility of the human mind. About how easy it is to dismiss someone's worries as paranoia when they may actually be legitimate warnings. About how we distinguish between justified and pathological fear. About what we do when someone's last words exist, but we can't determine whether to take them literally or see them as the product of a disturbed mind. And that's where the story really begins. When the student's family realized he was missing, the first thing they did was search his room for clues. It was a shared apartment near the university, and his roommates mentioned that he had been increasingly reclusive in recent weeks, spending more time locked in his room, going out less, and interacting less and less with the people around him. But none of this had seemed alarming enough to raise red flags. Many students go through periods of isolation, especially during exam periods or when dealing with academic stress. It was while going through his belongings that his mother found the diary. It was in a desk drawer, half hidden beneath some books and papers. It wasn't a traditional diary with a lock or decorative cover. It was just a regular spiral-bound notebook, the kind you'd buy at any stationery store. And perhaps that's why it had been so easy to overlook until that moment. It seemed like just another notebook among the dozens any student accumulates. And look, before I continue with this story that only gets more intriguing and disturbing, I need to tell you something. If you're here watching so far, it's probably because cases like this fascinate you as much as they fascinate me. And if this kind of content resonates with you, if you want to continue exploring real mysteries, unexplained disappearances, and stories that make you question the nature of reality, I invite you to join this community. Subscribe to the channel. Because every day there's a new real case here. Treat it with the depth and respect these stories and these people deserve. And leave a comment below about what's impacted you most so far. Have you ever kept a journal documenting thoughts that later seemed irrational? Or do you think we should always take someone seriously when they write that they're being stalked? I read every comment, and this exchange is what makes this space special. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who also care about these cases, who also want to understand what happens when someone simply disappears, leaving behind only enigmatic words. And if you're enjoying the content, please give the video a like. It may seem small, but it makes a huge difference in helping more people learn about this story and other missing person cases that deserve attention. It's what keeps this work alive and allows me to continue investigating and bringing these stories to you. Now, back to the diary. When the mother began reading the first few pages, she felt temporarily comforted. There was her son's voice, his thoughts. Everything seemed completely normal. But as she continued reading, as the pages progressed, that initial comfort was slowly replaced by something much darker. And what she discovered in those pages would completely change the way the family and investigators would understand the disappearance. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because to truly understand the magnitude of what was written in that diary, to comprehend why those words are so disturbing, we first need to know who the student who wrote them was. And that's precisely where this case becomes even more disconcerting. Because he wasn't someone living on the margins, not someone with a history of mental instability or erratic behavior. He was, by every possible definition, a brilliant young man with a promising future ahead of him. And perhaps that's precisely what makes the diary's final entries so haunting. His name was Daniel Carter. He was 22 years old when he disappeared, a third-year computer science major at a respected public university. Daniel wasn't just another student going through the motions. He was exceptionally intelligent, the kind of student professors hold up as role models, the kind other students seek out for help with complex projects. He had a very high GPA and had already published 2 papers at student conferences on artificial intelligence and machine learning. He was exactly the kind of young man you'd expect to see building a successful career in technology. Daniel's mindset, at least as far as anyone could see, was that of someone extremely rational and analytical. He approached problems systematically, thought in terms of logic and data, and wasn't given to magical thinking or conspiracy theories. Friends describe him as the most skeptical guy they knew, someone who always asked for evidence before accepting claims, who questioned assumptions, and who applied critical thinking to practically everything. He wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to develop paranoia or accept ideas without solid foundation. Daniel's academic journey had been impressive since high school. He had been accepted to multiple prestigious universities with partial scholarships, choosing the one that offered the best program in his field of interest. During his first 2.5 years of college, he maintained consistently excellent performance. There were no signs of academic decline, and no professors were concerned about changes in his behavior or work quality. He was on track to graduate with honors and had already received internship offers at respected technology companies. Socially, Daniel was also well-rounded. He had a close group of friends, mostly fellow computer science students, with whom he spent time regularly. They played video games together, participated in hackathons, and worked on side projects. Daniel was also an active member of the university's programming club and occasionally volunteered to tutor students from previous years who were struggling with programming concepts. He wasn't isolated or socially awkward. He had genuine connections with the people around him. The impact of knowing who Daniel was makes the diary's contents even more disturbing. Because when you read those final entries, when you see the shift from rational thinking to increasing paranoia, You can't simply dismiss it as another case of untreated mental illness. Daniel was precisely the kind of person you'd least expect to develop delusions or lose touch with reality. He had all the mental tools, all the training and logical thinking, all the support structure that would theoretically protect him from this kind of deterioration. Daniel's family was close and present. He came from a stable, middle-class home, with parents who always supported his education and aspirations. He had a younger sister who admired him greatly and saw him as a role model. Daniel spoke regularly with his parents on the phone, visited home a few times each semester, and maintained a healthy family connection that many college students maintain. There were no significant family conflicts, no recent dramas or traumas that could explain a sudden change in behavior or mental state. From a mental health perspective, Daniel had no prior psychiatric diagnoses. He had never seen a psychologist or psychiatrist, had never taken psychotropic medication, and had never shown symptoms of severe depression, debilitating anxiety, or any of the common markers of serious mental illness. Like any college student, he experienced moments of stress related to deadlines and exams, but nothing that suggested a particular vulnerability to mental breakdown. Daniel's life decisions were consistently sensible and well thought out. He managed his time efficiently, balanced study with social activities and rest, and maintained relatively healthy habits. He wasn't the type of person to make impulsive or risky choices. He was a planner, thought long-term, had clear goals, and worked methodically toward them. This personality trait makes what happened in the weeks before his disappearance particularly disconcerting. The behind the scenes of Daniel's life, as later revealed through interviews with friends and a review of his activities, showed no obvious signs of trouble. He was working on a senior project on machine learning applications in cybersecurity. It was ambitious but not overly stressful. He seemed to be progressing well. His advisor had no concerns. There was a side project Daniel was developing with two friends, a mobile app, but nothing particularly problematic or causing unusual stress. The hidden truth is that the more you learn about who Daniel was, the more incomprehensible the diary's contents become. There was no convenient narrative of gradual deterioration that sometimes explains dramatic changes in behavior. There was no known recreational drug use that could explain chemically induced paranoia. There was no recent trauma, no devastating romantic rejection, no academic failure that would shatter his self-esteem. He was just a brilliant young man, living a relatively normal college life, until something changed. Friends mentioned that in the last 3 or 4 weeks before his disappearance, Daniel had become a little quieter, a little more reserved. He still showed up for classes, still participated in group activities, but there was something subtly different. A close friend, Marcus, describes how Daniel was present but not fully there. He participated in conversations but seemed distracted, as if part of his attention was always elsewhere. But none of this was alarming enough to cause serious concern. There was one specific incident Marcus remembers that, in retrospect, seemed significant. About 2 weeks before the disappearance, they were working together in the university's computer lab late one night. Marcus went to get coffee and returned to find Daniel staring out the window, watching the parking lot below. When Marcus asked if everything was okay, Daniel gave a strange response. "Do you ever get the feeling someone is paying attention to you specifically?" Marcus laughed, joking about the paranoia of programmers who spend too much time in front of screens. Daniel didn't laugh along. He simply returned to his work in silence. At the time, Marcus didn't think much of it. It was a strange moment, certainly, but not necessarily indicative of a serious problem. College students say strange things all the time, especially when they're tired or stressed. But after the disappearance, after reading the diary, this moment took on a different meaning. It was possible that Daniel was already beginning to experience the concerns he would document so vividly in the notebook's pages. Daniel's transformation from a brilliant, rational student to someone seemingly consumed by paranoia didn't follow the typical pattern we'd expect to see in known psychiatric conditions. Adult-onset schizophrenia, for example, typically has a prodromal period with progressive symptoms. Substance-induced psychotic disorders obviously require substance use. Manic episodes with psychotic features come with other symptoms besides paranoia, such as grandiosity, increased impulsivity, and decreased need for sleep. But Daniel didn't fit neatly into any of these diagnostic categories. He continued to function academically until his disappearance, continued to attend classes, continued to complete assignments. There wasn't the kind of functional decline that typically accompanies severe psychotic episodes. It was as if two realities were operating simultaneously. The external reality where Daniel remained a competent student, and the internal reality documented in the diary where something much darker was happening. The most disturbing revelation is that Daniel was exactly the kind of person who should have been able to recognize when he was losing touch with reality. He had training in critical thinking, the ability to self-reflect, and enough knowledge about mental health to seek help if he recognized symptoms. The fact that he didn't seek help suggests either that he didn't see his thoughts as irrational, or that there was some reason he couldn't or wouldn't seek professional support. Comment there. This can happen to anyone. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because the day Daniel Carter disappeared began so utterly ordinary that no one could have predicted it would be the last day anyone would see him. And it's precisely the superficial normality that makes it all so disturbing. Because when you look at the chronology of that day, at every move Daniel made, at every interaction he had, you don't find that obvious, cinematic moment where everything visibly changes. It's just an ordinary day that suddenly ceases to be, and a person simply vanishes without explanation. It was a Thursday, November 15th. Daniel woke up at his usual time, around 7:30 in the morning, in the apartment he shared with 3 other students. One of his roommates, a young man named Tyler, ran into Daniel in the kitchen while they were making coffee. Tyler reports that they exchanged a few words about the data structures exam they had the following week and briefly discussed the college basketball game that weekend. It was a kind of mundane, forgettable interaction that happens between people who live together. Nothing memorable, nothing that would stick in their minds as the last normal conversation they would have. Daniel left home around 8:15 a.m. Another roommate was in the shower at the time and didn't even see him leave. This seemingly insignificant detail would later become a source of guilt for this roommate. If only I had left the bathroom earlier, if only I had said goodbye to him, if only I had noticed something different in his behavior, he said in later interviews, though everyone around him insisted there was nothing he could have noticed or done differently. Daniel's first class was at 9 in the morning, Advanced Algorithms, one of the core courses in the computer science curriculum. He arrived a few minutes before class started, as was his custom. The professor, Dr. Richard Hayes, would later mention that Daniel seemed completely normal that morning. He sat in his usual seat in the front row, opened his laptop, and when the professor asked a particularly difficult question about algorithmic complexity, Daniel was one of the few who raised his hand and gave a correct, well-articulated answer. There was no sign of confusion, no indication that anything was wrong. After class, around 10:30, campus security cameras captured Daniel walking toward the library. These images would later become crucial to the investigation because they were some of the last visual recordings of him. On the cameras, Daniel appears completely normal. He's walking at a casual pace, wearing headphones as he often did, occasionally glancing at his phone. His body language betrays no agitation or nervousness. He's just another student navigating campus on an ordinary Thursday morning. Daniel spent approximately 2 hours in the library. Access records show that he swiped his student ID at the electronic gate at 10:37 in the morning. Witnesses who were in the library that day, though they didn't know him personally, recalled seeing a young man matching Daniel's description working alone at one of the study tables, focused on his laptop, occasionally jotting down notes in a notebook. Nothing about this behavior was unusual or particularly noteworthy. The impact of reviewing these final hours is significant because it demonstrates that until very late in the day, Daniel was functioning completely within normal parameters. He was fulfilling his academic routine, participating in classes, using university resources, acting exactly as you expect a dedicated student to act. There was no erratic behavior captured on camera, no reports of strange interactions with others, nothing to suggest an imminent crisis. Around 12:40 p.m., Daniel met his friend Marcus at the campus cafeteria. They had arranged to meet a few days earlier. Marcus reports that they had lunch together for about 30 minutes, talking about the project they were working on together and discussing some code bugs they needed to fix. Marcus mentions that Daniel was a little quieter than usual, but not alarmingly so. He seemed tired, maybe a little distracted, but I assumed it was just end of semester stress, Marcus later told police. But there's one detail of that conversation that Marcus remembers that, in retrospect, takes on a disturbing meaning. At one point, Daniel asked Marcus if he'd researched himself online recently, if he'd ever checked what information about him was publicly available. Marcus found the question odd but not concerning, and replied something casual about digital privacy being an illusion in the modern age. Daniel simply nodded and changed the subject. At the time, it seemed like just random philosophical chatter. After the disappearance, after reading the diary, this question took on a much more sinister connotation. After lunch, Daniel had a 2 o'clock class, systems design. He arrived on time and sat in his usual seat. But around 2:45, approximately 45 minutes after class began, Daniel excused himself from Professor, gathered his things, and left the room. The professor, Dr. Amanda Chun, reports that Daniel seemed perfectly normal when he asked to leave, mentioning something about not feeling well and needing some fresh air. This type of departure wasn't entirely uncommon. Students occasionally need to leave class for various reasons. Daniel didn't return to class. And from that point on, around 3 p.m., the timeline becomes much more difficult to trace precisely. What we know comes mainly from security cameras scattered around campus and a few witnesses who saw him briefly. The cameras show Daniel leaving the building where he had class and walking quickly toward the parking lot where he kept his car, a 10-year-old gray Honda Accord he had inherited from his parents. One witness, a student named Emma Rodriguez, mentioned seeing Daniel in the parking lot around 3:15 p.m. She was getting out of her own car and noticed Daniel sitting in the driver's seat of the Honda, seemingly looking at something on his phone with an expression she described as focused or worried. Emma didn't think anything particularly suspicious at the time, just another student taking care of something in the car. But this memory would later prove crucial, because it was likely one of the last moments anyone definitively saw Daniel. The decisions Daniel made in that moment, sitting alone in the car, staring at his phone, are the heart of the mystery. What was going through his mind? Was there something on the phone that disturbed him? Was he reading something, talking to someone, discovering information that changed everything? Or was it simply the culmination of weeks of mounting worries documented in the journal? Finally reaching a breaking point? Around 3:45 p.m., security cameras at the parking lot exit captured Daniel's Honda leaving campus. The direction he took would have taken him toward downtown. But after that, the trail goes much colder. There's an unconfirmed sighting of someone matching Daniel's description at a convenience store approximately 5 miles from campus around 4:15 p.m. The store clerk wasn't entirely sure, but he remembers a young man who came in, wandered the aisles for a few minutes without buying anything, and then quickly left. The last digital evidence of Daniel's presence came from his cell phone. Carrier records show that the phone remained active until approximately 5:30 that afternoon, pinging cell towers in an industrial area on the outskirts of the city. And then at 5:32, Daniel's phone was either turned off or battery died. After that, there were no more digital signals, no more location pings, no social media activity, no credit card usage, nothing. When Daniel didn't show up for a project dinner with his group that night, a commitment they'd scheduled days before, his friends weren't initially overly concerned. They assumed he'd forgotten or something had come up. Marcus tried calling Daniel's cell phone, but went straight to voicemail. He sent a few text messages that were never answered. It wasn't until Daniel didn't return to the apartment that night, when his bed remained empty, that his roommates began to become genuinely concerned. Tyler tried to contact Daniel's parents on Friday morning, after confirming that no one had seen or heard from Daniel since the previous afternoon. His parents were immediately alarmed because Daniel always responded to their messages and maintained regular contact. They drove to campus that same day and, along with his roommates and friends, began searching for Daniel and any clues as to where he might have gone. It was during this initial search, when Daniel's mother was searching his room for anything that might indicate his plans or mental state, that she found the diary, and what she read in those pages completely transformed the nature of the search for her son. Right there. Where did he go? Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because the discovery of the diary was a moment that completely transformed everyone's understanding of what could have happened to Daniel. And the way it was found, the context of his discovery, adds layers of meaning to what was written in those pages. Because it wasn't a diary Daniel kept in a special or secret place. It wasn't something locked with a padlock or carefully hidden. It was there, in his desk drawer, among other notebooks and academic papers, as if it were just another item among many. Daniel's mother, Rebecca Carter, was in his room for the third or fourth time since they'd arrived on campus that Friday. She was searching for anything, any clue as to where her son might have gone, any indication of his plans or mental state. She'd already looked in the closet, under the bed, on the shelves. She was opening desk drawers when she found the notebook. It was a regular spiral notebook with a plain blue cover, the kind you'd find at any stationery store for a few dollars. There was no name on the cover, no label identifying it as a diary or a journal. It was just a notebook. Rebecca almost passed it by without paying much attention. There were other similar notebooks in the same drawer, most containing notes from Daniel's classes. But something made her pick up this particular one and open it. Maybe it was maternal intuition, maybe it was just luck or chance. But when she opened the first page and saw the date written at the top followed by text that clearly wasn't academic notes, she knew she found something different. These were Daniel's personal thoughts, written in the first person, documenting not class material but everyday experiences and reflections. The emotional impact of beginning to read those first pages was initially comforting for Rebecca. It was her son's voice, his thoughts, his words. Most importantly, the first few entries were completely normal, even mundane. Rebecca sat on Daniel's bed, holding a notebook with hands trembling slightly with emotion and anxiety, and began reading from the beginning. The first entry was dated approximately 2.5 months before the disappearance, early September, just after the start of the semester. That first entry was about the start classes, about how excited Daniel was about his semester's courses, particularly one on artificial intelligence that he'd been looking forward to for years. He mentioned his professors, briefly described the projects he'd have to complete, and commented on his classmates. It was the kind of reflection thousands of college students make at the start of each academic semester. There was nothing unusual, nothing to raise concerns about. He was just a young man documenting his student life. The following entries maintained this completely normal tone. Daniel wrote about study group meetings, frustrating bugs in the code he was developing for a project, and watching a movie with friends over the weekend. There was a particularly long entry about a philosophical conversation he had with Marcus about the ethics of artificial intelligence, whether truly intelligent machines have moral rights. It was the kind of intellectual discussion that technology students love to have, demonstrating healthy mental engagement and curiosity about complex issues. The hidden truth that emerges from these first pages is that Daniel was clearly functioning well when he began the diary. There were no prodromal signs of mental illness, no indications of disorganized thinking or nascent paranoia. His writing was clear and coherent. His concerns were appropriate and proportionate. His plans were realistic and well thought out. Any psychologist reading these early entries would conclude that the author was mentally healthy and emotionally balanced. There were also personal aspects documented. Daniel wrote about missing his family, about considering visiting home for the next long weekend, about his younger sister who was applying to colleges and asking for his advice. He mentioned a girl he met at a department party, someone he found interesting and was considering asking out. These were completely normal concerns and interests of a 22-year-old navigating college life. Daniel's decisions during this period, as documented in his journal, were all sensible and well-founded. He wrote about how to choose between 2 optional projects and detailed the decision-making process, weighing the pros and cons, considering how each option aligned with his long-term goals, and consulting with his academic advisor. This was clear evidence of rational thinking and planning ability. There was no impulsiveness, no erratic or ill-considered decisions. Rebecca kept reading, page after page, finding more of the same. Normal reflections, appropriate concerns, realistic plans. There were moments of humor. 2. Daniel had a dry sense of humor, and often made sarcastic observations about everyday situations. He wrote a particularly funny entry about a class where a professor had technical difficulties with the projector, and how half the computer science class kept shouting increasingly complex suggestions while a professor simply wanted to connect the HDMI cable correctly. But then, as Rebecca progressed through pages, she began to notice a subtle shift. It wasn't dramatic at first, not an obvious shift from one entry to the next. It was gradual, almost imperceptible if you weren't paying attention. The entries began to include remarks about feeling watched. Daniel mentioned for the first time, almost as a footnote in a longer entry on another topic, that he'd had the strange sensation of someone paying attention to him in the library. He dismissed it as silly paranoia caused by too much coffee, but the mention was there. The journey through these intervening pages reveals a gradual transformation in Daniel's mindset. The entries were still coherent and well-written, but the content was changing. He began mentioning strange coincidences, like meeting the same person in different places on consecutive days, or how certain cars always seemed to be parked near where he was going. Initially, he questioned these observations, recognizing that they probably meant nothing, that his brain was making connections where none existed. But as the weeks passed, as documented by the dates in the entries, the nature of the notes changed. Daniel began using the word they, without specifying who they were. They were at the cafe today, he wrote in one entry from mid-October. They know about the project. In another few days later, there was no explanation of who they were, no context that would make these statements understandable to an outside reader. The background to what was going on in Daniel's mind during this period remains mysterious, but the diary offers a disturbing window into his subjective experience. He clearly believed he was being watched, monitored in some way, and most disturbingly, he seemed to be trying to document evidence, to make sense of what he was experiencing. There were lists in the margins of some pages, attempts to trace patterns, connections between events that seemed significant to him. Rebecca felt her stomach tighten as she read these most recent entries. She recognized her son's writing. The penmanship was his. The way he structured sentences was distinctive, but the content was becoming increasingly troubling, and she hadn't yet reached the final pages, hadn't yet read the final entry that would leave her utterly devastated and confused. What makes these interim entries particularly disconcerting is that they maintain internal coherence. Daniel wasn't writing nonsense or word salad. His sentences made grammatical sense. His paragraphs had a logical structure. It was just the content, the beliefs he was expressing, that seemed increasingly disconnected from the reality everyone around him shared. It was like watching someone gradually slip into a parallel reality where different rules and connections governed. There were also clear attempts by Daniel to validate his concerns. He wrote about researching online to see if others experienced similar feelings of surveillance. He documented setting up a camera in his room to see if anyone entered while he was away. Though he later admitted the recordings showed nothing, it was evidence that part of him was still trying to apply rational thought, trying to find objective evidence for subjective feelings. But this rational impulse was clearly losing the battle against something else. Comment there, the diary shows everything. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because as Rebecca continued reading her son's diary, as the pages progressed chronologically, the transformation became increasingly pronounced and impossible to ignore. What had begun as occasional observations about feeling watched had evolved into something much more intense, much more consuming of Daniel's attention and mental energy. And it was this gradual progression that made it all so frightening, because you could literally see, page by page, the change happening in real time. The entries from late October and early November marked the point where the transformation visibly accelerates. Daniel began writing more frequently, sometimes multiple entries in a single day, as if he needed to document everything he observed before forgetting the details. His handwriting, which had always been careful and legible in the first few pages, began to become more hurried, more irregular. It wasn't illegible, but you could feel the urgency in the way the pen pressed against the paper, and the words occasionally crossed out and rewritten, in the sentences that began and then were abandoned midway through. Daniel's mindset, as revealed in these pages, was clearly changing. They became a constant presence in his notes. They were no longer casual mentions or passing observations. They were the central focus of many entries. They were waiting outside the library today. Daniel wrote in an entry dated October 28th. They pretended to be smoking, but I know they were waiting to see when I would come out. I tried to use the side exit, but one of them saw me anyway. They always know. The impact of reading these words, especially knowing that Daniel had disappeared just weeks after writing them, is profound. Rebecca felt tears welling up as she read, realizing that her son was clearly suffering, clearly experiencing something that terrified him, but no one around him had noticed. Or if they had noticed subtle signs, they hadn't recognized the gravity of the situation. Daniel also attempted to identify patterns and connections. He began making lists in the margins of some pages, documenting places where he'd seen the same people, times when he felt most intense surveillance, and the types of cars that repeatedly appeared near his location. It was a clear attempt to apply logical and systematic thought to the situation, to collect data that could validate or refute his concerns. But the lists made no sense to anyone but him. They were license plates without context, vague descriptions of people, and locations connected only in Daniel's mind. The decisions Daniel was making during this period, as documented in his journal, began to reflect his growing concerns. He wrote about deliberately changing his routine, taking different routes to classes, going to the library at random times, and avoiding certain places where he felt they would be waiting. He mentioned starting to use only cash instead of credit cards because they can't track money so easily. These were the behaviors of someone genuinely believing they were under surveillance and trying to protect themselves. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the pages from this middle phase were the drawings. Daniel had begun sketching in the margins and occasionally across entire pages. These weren't artistic drawings in the traditional sense. They were diagrams, maps, connections between points. There was one particularly elaborate drawing that took up a full page, showing a university campus with X's marking various locations, lines connecting the points, arrows indicating directions. Beside it were notes. Observation point 1, where the gray car always is, possible escape route. The journey through these pages shows Daniel trying to map and understand what he perceived as the surveillance network around him. There was another diagram that appeared to be an attempt to organize information about them. In the center of the page, Daniel had written simply them in capital letters, and then drawn lines radiating out to vague descriptions. Man in black coat, seen 4 times. Woman with short hair, always at the cafe. Person in dark car, parking lot. It was as if he were trying to create a dossier on the observers he believed were monitoring him. The hidden truth in these pages is that Daniel was clearly experiencing something deeply real to him, regardless of whether it corresponded to the objective reality others around him shared. He wasn't faking it, wasn't creating an elaborate story for attention or drama. He genuinely believed he was being watched, and this belief was consuming more and more of his mental and emotional energy. You can feel the fear and frustration emanating from the pages. There were also documented moments of self-reflective doubt. In an entry from November 3rd, Daniel wrote, "Sometimes I wonder if I'm going crazy. Marcus looked at me strangely today when I mentioned the cars. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But how do I explain the coincidence of seeing the same people so often? It can't just be chance." It was evidence that part of Daniel was still trying to maintain rational perspective, still questioning his own perceptions. But that voice of doubt grew fainter and fainter as the entries progressed. The revelations continued as Rebecca turned the pages. Daniel wrote about researching electronic surveillance online, about techniques government agencies and corporations use to track people. He mentioned turning off location services on his cell phone, covering his laptop's camera with duct tape, and starting to use a browser with privacy mode always on. These were actions of someone trying to protect themselves against a perceived threat. But to outside observers, they would appear to be paranoid behavior. There was also a change in the way Daniel wrote about social interactions. In the early pages of his diary, he had documented conversations with friends in a positive and engaging way. But in his more recent entries, there was a hint of suspicion. "Marcus asked strange questions about my routine today," he wrote. "Why would he need to know when I go to the library? Did they ask him to monitor me?" It was a clear indication that paranoia was beginning to affect his relationships, causing him to question even close friends. The behind-the-scenes look at Daniel's external life during this period, as later revealed through interviews with friends and colleagues, revealed someone who was still functioning superficially but with subtle changes. Friends mentioned that Daniel had become more reserved, that he sometimes seemed distant or preoccupied, but nothing so dramatic as to raise urgent alarms. He still attended classes, still participated in projects, still occasionally hung out with the group. The deterioration documented in the diary was far more severe than anything visible externally. In one entry from mid-November, just days before the disappearance, Daniel wrote something particularly disturbing. "They're not just observers. They're doing something. They're preparing for something. I can feel it. The surveillance is more intense. More people are involved now. I need to find out what they want before it's too late." The urgency in these words is palpable. Daniel clearly believed he was in increasing danger, that there was a temporal threat involved. There were also cryptic references to the project in some entries. Daniel mentioned that it might have something to do with the project, but never specified which project. He had several academic projects underway at the time. Was it one of them? Or was it something else entirely? Some project that existed only in his interpretation of reality? This ambiguity makes interpreting the diary even more difficult. Rebecca realized she was reaching the final pages of writing. There were still several blank pages afterward, but the text area was ending. She could see that the last entry was noticeably shorter than the previous ones, and the handwriting seemed even more hurried. Her heart raced as she turned the page to read the last words her son had documented before he disappeared. Right there, change is scary. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because Daniel's final diary entry is the most crucial and disturbing piece of this entire mystery. And when Rebecca finally reached that final page, when her eyes roamed over those last words her son wrote before disappearing, she felt something snap inside her, because here was definitive evidence that Daniel was in deep mental distress, but also the frustrating impossibility of knowing whether that distress was a product of a diseased mind or reaction to genuine danger. The last entry was dated November 15th, the same day as the disappearance. Daniel had written in the morning, probably before leaving for campus, because he mentioned getting ready for classes. But the handwriting in this entry was remarkably different from anything that had come before. It wasn't the careful, legible writing of the first few pages, nor even the hurried yet controlled writing of the middle entries. It was shaky, irregular, with poorly formed letters and words that occasionally strayed from the horizontal line, moving up or down the page erratically. The visual impact of this change in writing is significant because it suggests that Daniel was in a state of extreme agitation when he wrote those final words. The pen had pressed hard against the paper in some places, nearly tearing the page. In other places, the letters were so light they were almost imperceptible. It was a writing of someone whose hand was shaking, whether from fear, exhaustion, something chemical in the system, or some combination of factors we will never know for sure. The entry's content began with a seemingly mundane observation, but one laden with disturbing significance in the context of everything that preceded it. "I only slept for 2 hours," Daniel wrote. "I kept hearing sounds. Footsteps in the hallway that stopped in front of my door. Someone tried the doorknob at 3 a.m. I didn't open it. I pretended to be asleep. Tyler said he didn't hear anything when I asked him this morning. Of course he didn't. He's not the target." The mindset revealed in these sentences is that of someone deeply paranoid, believing they are specifically targeted for surveillance or threat, but also aware enough to realize that others around them do not share their perceptions. This awareness of the discrepancy between their reality and that of others is particularly disturbing because it shows that Daniel was not completely disconnected. He knew his experiences were unique to him, but he interpreted this not as evidence that he might be hallucinating or delusional, but rather as evidence that he specifically was being targeted. The decisions Daniel documented that he made that final morning reveal increasingly disorganized thinking, but still with attempts at internal logic. "I'll vary the route today. Library first, not the classroom building. Maybe that will confuse them long enough. I need to access the server files. Check if they left anything in my directory. They have access. I'm sure of it now. The permissions have been changed." There was mention of the project again, but this time with more detail, though still cryptic. If this has anything to do with what I discovered in the code, then it makes sense why it started when it did. 3 weeks ago, right after I ran that analysis. I shouldn't have seen it, but I did, and now they know I know. These phrases suggest that Daniel believed he had discovered something significant, some information or pattern that had drawn unwanted attention. But what exactly it was remains mysterious because he never clearly specified. The journey through these final sentences shows Daniel trying to organize his thoughts, try and make sense of what he believed was happening, but increasingly lost in connections only he could see. It's not a coincidence. None of this is a coincidence. The patterns are too obvious once you know how to look. Marcus doesn't see them because he doesn't want to, or because they've already gotten to him. It's hard to know who can still trust. And then, after 2 paragraphs of relatively dense text, there was blank space on the page, as if Daniel had stopped writing, perhaps interrupted, or stepped away from his notebook for a few minutes. And when he resumed, when he put pen back to paper, he had written only 3 words. 3 words in handwriting even shakier than the rest of the entry, irregular capital letters, the pen pressing so hard it left visible indentations on the pages below. They are already here. After those 3 words, nothing. The page had more space, but Daniel didn't write anything else, and the following pages of the notebook were completely blank. Those 3 words were literally the last Daniel Carter had written before disappearing a few hours later. The hidden truth in this final sentence is that it can mean multiple things depending on how you interpret it. If Daniel was experiencing paranoid psychosis, there already here could be a manifestation of persecutory delusion reaching peak intensity. The belief that the imaginary persecutors were no longer just watching from afar, but had arrived, were present, and posed an immediate threat. In this interpretation, the sentence documents the moment of maximum psychological terror that preceded Daniel's impulsive and potentially self-harming actions. But if there's any possibility that Daniel was responding to real danger, if there was genuinely someone or something monitoring or threatening him, then "they're already here" takes on a much more sinister meaning. It becomes a warning, a documentation of the moment when the threat materialized from distant to immediate. In this interpretation, Daniel was trying to leave a record of what was happening, knowing he might not have another chance to document it. The revelations that emerge from analyzing this final sentence are frustrating precisely because we cannot definitively determine which interpretation is correct. We have no access to Daniel's mind at that moment. We cannot know whether what he was experiencing was a hallucination or a perception of reality that others around him could not see. The ambiguity is permanent and agonizing. Rebecca, holding the diary with trembling hands, reread those 3 words over and over, as if she could extract additional meaning by force of will. She searched for anything else on the page, any mark or note that might provide further context. There was a small stain that might have been a tear, the paper slightly wrinkled at that point. Did this suggest Daniel had been crying when he wrote? Or was it just accidentally spilled water? Impossible to know. The behind the scenes of what happened in the hours immediately after Daniel wrote these words is what everyone desperately wants to understand. He wrote this closed the notebook, put it back in the drawer, and then left for what seemed like a normal day of classes. He interacted with Tyler briefly, went to campus, and attended class that morning. How could someone who was clearly in a state of extreme terror, as documented in the journal, function superficially for several hours afterward? What kind of willpower or dissociation allowed this? Daniel's decision not to share the diary with anyone, not to explicitly ask for help despite clearly suffering, is another disturbing aspect. He had a loving family, close friends, and access to mental health services on campus. But he apparently chose not to access any of these resources. Why? Was it because he believed no one would take him seriously? Because he thought revealing his concerns would put him in greater danger? Or because some aspect of his mental condition prevented him from recognizing that he needed help? The phrase, "they're already here," also raises the question of who or what they was. Throughout the diary, Daniel used this plural pronoun, without ever clearly defining who he was referring to. Were they specific people? Were they organizations? Were they more abstract entities? The lack of clarity makes it impossible to assess whether his concerns were grounded in reality or merely the constructs of a crisis-ridden mind. Comment there, 3 words that change everything. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because when the police were finally involved, when the diary was handed over to investigators and the official search for Daniel began, each discovery they made didn't bring the answers everyone expected. Instead, each clue, each piece of evidence, each analysis added more layers to the mystery, and what should have been a relatively straightforward case of a missing student quickly turned into one of the most perplexing enigmas investigators had ever faced. The first line of investigation was to track Daniel's final movements using all available technological tools. As I mentioned before, carrier records showed that his cell phone had remained active until approximately 5:32 p.m. on November 15th, pinging towers in an industrial area on the outskirts of the city. Investigators went to the specific area, a region with a few abandoned warehouses, a few small factories, and very little residential activity. It wasn't a place where a college student would have any obvious reason to be. They searched the area extensively. Search and rescue teams scoured every abandoned building, every vacant lot, every possible hiding place. Sniffer dogs were brought in, using Daniel's clothing to establish the scent trail. The dogs followed a path for a few hundred meters, seemingly indicating Daniel had been in that area, but then lost the scent near a gravel parking lot used by truckers. It was as if Daniel had simply disappeared at that point, or perhaps gotten into a vehicle that took him elsewhere. The impact of this discovery was significant because it opened up multiple possibilities. If Daniel had entered a vehicle, was it voluntary or under duress? Was someone waiting for him there? Or had he hitched a ride with a stranger? The industrial area wasn't a place you'd accidentally end up. It had to be an intentional destination. But why would Daniel go there? What did he expect to find or do there? Daniel's car, a gray Honda Accord, was located 3 days after his disappearance. It was parked on a street approximately 2 kilometers from the industrial area where his cell phone had last signaled. The vehicle was locked, the keys were missing, and an initial inspection revealed no signs of a struggle or violence. But a more detailed forensic analysis of the car yielded some intriguing discoveries. There were fingerprints other than Daniel's, but when checked against the system, they matched friends and colleagues known to have been in the car on previous occasions. Nothing suspicious there. More interesting was what they found in the glove compartment. There was a printed map of the city with numerous hand-drawn markers, circles around certain blocks, excess marking specific locations, notes in the margins that were difficult to read but appeared to be addresses or coordinates. Some of these marked locations corresponded to places mentioned in the diary as spots where Daniel felt most intense surveillance, but others had no obvious connection to anything. The hidden truth in this map is that it suggested planning. Daniel hadn't gone to that industrial area on impulse. He had prepared, he had mapped, he had chosen that location for a reason that made sense to him but remained mysterious to everyone else. Investigators tried to understand the logic behind the marked locations, looking for geographic patterns or thematic connections. Some of the locations were near public security cameras, which would suggest Daniel was documenting surveillance points, but others were just unremarkable residential streets. The decisions that led investigators to search for Daniel's laptop were obvious. If someone is having paranoid thoughts about digital surveillance and code discoveries, the computer will be a logical place to look for evidence. But the laptop wasn't in Daniel's apartment when the family and police searched. It wasn't in the car either. For weeks, no one knew where it was. Then, approximately a month after the disappearance, the laptop was found in a bizarre situation. A homeless man had tried to sell a computer at a pawn shop, and the clerk, following standard protocol, checked the serial number and discovered it matched Daniel Carter's laptop, which had been reported as belonging to a missing person. The homeless man was located and interviewed extensively. He insisted he had found the laptop in a dumpster near the industrial area, approximately a week after Daniel's disappearance. The journey of trying to extract information from the laptop was frustrating. The computer would turn on, but it was protected by a password that no one in the family knew. Digital forensics experts eventually managed to access the system, but what they found was disconcerting. Many files had been recently deleted, and while some things could be recovered, there were significant gaps. The browsing history had been cleared, and chat conversations had been erased. It appeared that someone had deliberately wiped data before discarding the laptop, but not everything had been erased. In Daniel's project directory, they found several code files related to his classwork, and in one of these projects, there were extensive comments Daniel had written himself in the margins of the code. Some were technical, explaining why a certain function was implemented a certain way, but others were strange. "It shouldn't be possible," read one comment. "The patterns don't make sense unless someone is manipulating the input data," said another. "Check if the server has been compromised," said a third. Cybersecurity experts carefully reviewed the code. Daniel's project involved network traffic data analysis, part of his anomaly detection work for security discipline. The code itself was well written and worked correctly, but Daniel's comments suggested he had seen something in the results that concerned him, something he interpreted as evidence of outside interference. The experts couldn't identify anything objectively abnormal in the data or results. Everything seemed normal to them. This raises a disturbing question. Had Daniel actually detected something the experts missed, some subtle anomaly that only he recognized? Or was he seeing patterns where none existed, interpreting random noise as meaningful signals because his mindset was already biased toward paranoid thinking? This distinction is crucial, but perhaps impossible to make definitively. The background to the investigation also included extensive psychological analysis of the diary. Multiple psychologists and psychiatrists were consulted and asked to review the entries and provide a professional assessment of Daniel's mental state. The general consensus was that the entries demonstrated progressive paranoid thinking consistent with several possible diagnoses: recent onset schizophrenia, brief psychotic disorder, or possible substance-induced psychosis, although there was no clear evidence of drug use. But there was disagreement among experts on certain aspects. Some pointed out that Daniel's writing maintained coherence and organization, even in the most paranoid entries, which would be unusual in severe psychosis. Others noted that the gradual transformation documented in the diary didn't exactly follow the typical pattern of adult-onset schizophrenia. It was almost as if Daniel had two narratives operating simultaneously: the external one, where he continued to function academically, and the internal one, documented in the diary, where he became increasingly convinced of surveillance. Attempts to decipher the cryptic references in the diary consumed hours of investigative work. Mentions of them were meticulously tracked. Investigators interviewed every person Daniel had mentioned in the diary, checked alibis, and looked for any suspicious connections. But they found nothing to suggest a real conspiracy or organized threat against Daniel. The people he had described as possible vigilantes were just ordinary citizens with no connection to each other or to Daniel. The car references were also investigated. License plates Daniel had noted were traced. Some corresponded to vehicles belonging to students or university staff who were legitimately on campus. Others belonged to residents of the surrounding area. There was no suspicious pattern. There were no vehicles registered to government agencies or private security companies. It was exactly what you'd expect to find: random cars belonging to random people who happened to cross Daniel's path at various times. The investigators' mindset shifted over weeks as more information was gathered, but no clear explanation emerged. Initially, there was hope that it was a relatively straightforward case. Daniel had suffered a mental breakdown, left in a confused state, and would be found soon, alive but in need of medical attention. But as weeks turned into months with no sign of him, no use of his credit card, no appearances at hospitals or shelters, no body found, the nature of the case became much more ambiguous and murky. Comment there: nothing fits perfectly. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because after analyzing all the evidence, all the testimonies, and all the clues that raise more questions than answers, we've reached a point where we need to confront the theories about what really happened to Daniel Carter. And the truth is, there are multiple possible explanations, each with elements that make sense, but also gaps that can't be easily filled. What I'll do now is present these theories honestly and balancedly, because none of them have been proven and perhaps never will be. The first theory, and probably most widely accepted by most medical professionals who reviewed the case, is that Daniel suffered a relatively sudden psychotic episode. Although he had no history of serious mental illness, conditions like schizophrenia typically manifest in early adulthood, precisely Daniel's age range. The diary documents a progression that could be consistent with the development of psychosis, increasing paranoia, delusions of persecution, and interpreting normal events as evidence of conspiracy against him. The mindset of someone experiencing a first psychotic episode may include an overwhelming sense of threat, an unshakable belief that they are being monitored or persecuted, and an inability to distinguish between distorted perceptions and objective reality. In this scenario, Daniel genuinely believed that they were watching, that there was increasing danger, and we wrote "they're already here." He was documenting a peak of psychological terror. The decision to go to that industrial area could have been a result of disorganized thinking and irrational impulses typical of an acute psychotic state. This theory would explain why no evidence of actual surveillance was found, why the people Daniel identified as possible vigilantes were just ordinary citizens, why the patterns he saw in the data weren't apparent to experts. Not because he was right and everyone else was wrong, but because his mind was creating connections that didn't objectively exist. The disappearance itself could have been the result of Daniel, in a confused and terrified state, getting lost, having an accident, or even making a tragic decision to permanently flee what he perceived as an inescapable threat. But this theory has problems. The most significant is that Daniel continued to function academically until the day he disappeared. He attended classes, completed assignments, and interacted appropriately with teachers and peers. Severe psychosis typically compromises functioning in more obvious ways. There would be more outward signs, and more people would notice dramatic behavioral changes. The discrepancy between the deterioration documented in the diary and the relatively normal outward functioning is difficult to fully reconcile with a straightforward diagnosis of psychosis. The second theory involves drugs. Perhaps Daniel experimented with a substance that induced paranoia, or worse, perhaps he was unintentionally drugged with something that caused the symptoms he experienced. Certain drugs, particularly stimulants like methamphetamine or cocaine, can cause severe paranoia even in users with no history of mental illness. Other substances, especially compounded or adulterated, can produce psychotic effects that last for days or weeks. The impact of this theory is that it would explain the relatively sudden onset of Daniel's symptoms and their rapid progression. Drug use would also explain why he might have deleted information from his laptop and disposed it in an odd way, an attempt to hide evidence of use. The industrial area where he was last seen could be linked to the purchase or use of substances. No toxicology tests were performed on Daniel because he was never found, so this possibility cannot be ruled out. But again, there's no solid evidence of drug use. Friends insist that Daniel didn't use recreational substances, that he was skeptical of drugs precisely because he valued mental clarity. There was no drug paraphernalia in his room or car. There were no suspicious financial transactions suggesting the purchase of illegal substances. If he was using drugs, he was extremely careful to conceal all evidence, which would be unusual behavior for someone in the throes of substance-induced psychosis. The third theory is perhaps the most disturbing because it suggests that Daniel might have been right, at least partially, that he had discovered something genuinely dangerous, witnessed a crime, or investigated a situation that put him at real risk. The references in the code to data anomalies, the comments about server manipulation, could be evidence that Daniel had stumbled upon something he shouldn't have seen. Perhaps hacking activity, perhaps a corporate or government surveillance operation, perhaps a criminal scheme using the university's digital infrastructure. In this interpretation, the diary documents not paranoia, but rather a gradual recognition of a real threat. The people he identified as watchmen were indeed monitoring him. They were simply professional enough not to leave obvious traces. The decision to go to the industrial area could have been an attempt to confront someone, obtain evidence, or even an arranged meeting with someone who promised explanations. And the disappearance was not the result of a mental breakdown, but rather something much more sinister. Kidnapping, the permanent silencing of an inconvenient witness. But the investigation behind the scenes found no evidence to support this theory. Investigators with experience in organized crime and real-life conspiracies reviewed the case and found no hallmarks of these scenarios. There was no body, which would be unusual if it were a professional assassination. There were no ransom demands, no documented threats, and no connections between Daniel and organizations or individuals typically involved in this type of crime. The theory is possible, but it requires assuming a level of criminal sophistication that would leave absolutely zero detectable evidence. The fourth theory is a variation of the third, that there was actual stalking, but by an individual or small group rather than a professional organization. Perhaps someone had developed a fixation on Daniel, or perhaps there was interpersonal conflict that escalated beyond anyone's perception. Stalkers can be extraordinarily persistent and create a genuine sense of being constantly watched. If Daniel was being targeted by a skilled stalker, it would explain his growing concerns without necessarily involving a large-scale conspiracy. But again, there was no evidence of a stalker. No one in Daniel's life had ever displayed obsessive behavior toward him. There were no threatening messages saved on his devices, no history of restraining orders, or serious interpersonal conflicts. Investigators specifically looked for this type of pattern and found nothing. If there was a stalker, this person was extraordinarily careful not to leave any digital traces or testimonies. There's also a fifth, more unusual theory that has gained some traction in online communities discussing the case, that Daniel may have been involved, knowingly or unknowingly, in an ARG, alternate reality game, or some sort of psychological experiment that got out of hand. ARGs are immersive games that blur the line between fiction and reality, often involving hidden clues, mysterious characters, and complex narratives. If Daniel had started participating in an ARG without fully realizing it was a game, or someone had used the ARG concept to manipulate him, this could explain some of the strange elements of the case. Daniel's decisions, such as mapping specific locations and going to an industrial area, could be consistent with following clues from an elaborate game. The references to they could be characters from the game. The deleted laptop could be an attempt to protect game information or hide the fact that he was participating. And the disappearance could be part of the game gone too far, or Daniel genuinely getting lost in the border between game and reality. But investigators found no evidence of Daniel's participation in any known ARG. There were no online forums, no discussion groups, no communication with other players. If it was a game, there was no digital trace of him, which would be extremely unusual in an age where virtually everything online leaves a footprint. The theory is imaginative but unsupported by concrete evidence. The hidden truth may be that what happened to Daniel is a combination of factors, not a single, simple explanation. Perhaps he had an undiagnosed mental vulnerability triggered by stress, lack of sleep, or occasional substance use. Perhaps there was also a real element of coincidence that he interpreted as patterns. The human journey of making sense of random events is powerful, and brains are extraordinarily good at finding patterns even where none exist. Right there, so many possibilities, no answers. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because so far we've talked about evidence, theories, investigations, and possibilities. But there's a side to this case that's easy to forget when you're focused on the technical details and interpretations of what might have happened. The real people left behind. The family who woke up one normal day and realized Daniel would never return. The lives that were completely transformed by this disappearance. Because behind every word written in that diary, there's real pain, real loss, and real people desperately trying to decipher his last words in the hope of finding some meaning, some clue, some way to bring their son, their brother, their friend back. Let's start with Rebecca and Tom Carter, Daniel's parents. Ever since they found the diary, their lives have become an obsessive journey of trying to understand exactly when things change, the precise moment their son began the slippage into reality that culminated in his disappearance. Rebecca, in particular, reads the diary almost daily. She's memorized the entries, knows every word, every phrase, every subtle change in the handwriting. It's as if by reading and rereading, she might eventually find key everyone else missed, the revelation that would explain everything. The emotional impact of gaining access to your son's most intimate thoughts during the period leading up to the loss is uniquely devastating. It's not like when someone disappears without leaving anything behind, leaving you with only memories and questions. Rebecca has Daniel's words, documentary evidence of what he was thinking and feeling. But instead of bringing comfort or clarity, the diary brings agonizing frustration because it shows that Daniel was suffering deeply, and she didn't know, couldn't help, had no chance to intervene before it was too late. Rebecca talks about the guilt she carries. I talk to him every week on the phone, she said in an interview months after the disappearance, tears streaming down her face. How could I not have realized something was wrong? How could a mother not feel when her child is in danger? She revisits every phone conversation from the past few weeks, searching for signs she missed, for moments where she had asked the right question. Perhaps Daniel would have opened up, asked for help, shared what he was experiencing. Tom handled the situation differently, but equally painfully. He became obsessed with trying to validate or refute Daniel's concerns. He drove to the university multiple times, walked the same routes Daniel documented in his journal, sat in the same places in the library, tried to see what Daniel saw. He was searching for evidence of real surveillance, desperately wanted to believe his son was responding to a genuine threat and not losing his sanity. Because in some twisted way, the idea that Daniel was right about them seemed more bearable than the idea that his son's brilliant mind had fractured for no apparent reason. The decisions Rebecca and Tom made about whether or not to share the diary publicly were agonizing. On the one hand, the more people who read Daniel's words, the greater the chance someone would recognize a pattern, understand a reference, or gain an insight that would lead to answers. On the other hand, these were their son's intimate last words, private thoughts never intended for public consumption. Eventually, they decided to share selected excerpts with investigators and a few experts, but keep the majority private. It was their way of protecting Daniel's dignity even after his disappearance. There was also Daniel's sister, Sarah, who was 17 when her brother disappeared. She was a senior in high school, applying to colleges, making plans for the future. Daniel was her hero, the brilliant older brother she admired and tried to emulate when he disappeared. When she read his diary entries, her world was turned upside down in ways she's still processing years later. Sarah carried specific and particularly painful guilt. The last time she saw Daniel, 2 weeks before his disappearance when he visited home for a weekend, they had a silly argument about something she no longer remembers exactly. She was angry with him, said some rude things, and they didn't fully reconcile before he returned to campus. That negative interaction became her final memory with her brother, and the guilt of it haunts her constantly. If I'd known it would be the last time, she says, I would have told him I loved him. I would have paid more attention. I would have noticed something was wrong. The mindset of someone who lost an older brother in this way is complex. Sarah feels that part of her disappeared with Daniel. She lost not only her present brother, but also the future she had imagined with him. Him being at her wedding one day, meeting her children, being a present uncle. All these possibilities were erased that November day. And unlike death, where there is a body, a funeral, and a recognized grieving process, Daniel's disappearance leaves her in a permanent limbo between hope and despair. Daniel's friends, particularly Marcus, who was closest to him, carry their own burdens of guilt and confusion. Marcus constantly revisits the last few weeks before the disappearance, searching for signs he should have noticed. That moment in the lab when Daniel asked about feeling watched, Marcus laughed and joked. I should have taken it seriously, Marcus says. I should have asked more questions. I should have insisted he talk to someone. But I just assumed it was end of semester stress like we all experience. The hidden truth is that even if Marcus had reacted differently, even if he had insisted that Daniel seek help, there's no guarantee it would have changed the outcome. Adults can refuse help. They can hide how bad they're feeling. They can make decisions that friends and family can't prevent. But this rational truth does little to alleviate the emotional guilt Marcus feels. He lost his best friend in a way you'll never be able to fully understand. A glimpse into the lives of Daniel's friends in the months and years after his disappearance reveals a lasting impact. The group of friends who used to gather regularly for projects and games fractured. It was too difficult to be together without Daniel there, without his absence dominating every interaction. Some withdrew completely, unable to process the loss. Others clung to each other with almost desperate intensity, as if closeness could somehow protect against future losses. Experts who were consulted to analyze the diary were also not unscathed by the experience. Dr. Patricia Williams, a clinical psychologist who spent weeks studying Daniel's entries, admits that the case affected her deeply. You read these pages and see a brilliant mind fragmenting in real time, she says. It's like watching a tragedy in slow motion, knowing how it ends, but unable to do anything to change its course. And what makes it even more difficult is not being able to definitively determine whether Daniel was experiencing psychosis or responding to a real threat. This ambiguity haunts you. The quest to perform a graphological analysis of Daniel's handwriting also revealed disturbing patterns. Handwriting experts noted that changes in handwriting across the pages corresponded to emotional content. In the early entries, the writing was fluid, relaxed, and the letters well-formed. As paranoia grew, the writing became tighter, more angular, with increased pen pressure. In the final entry, the writing was almost violent in the way the pen pressed against the paper, with visible tremors. It's the writing of someone in extreme psychological distress, a graphologist commented. Whatever the cause, Daniel was terrified when he wrote those last words. The impact of this case extended beyond Daniel's immediate circle. The entire university was affected. There were discussions about whether better systems should be in place to identify students in mental health crises, and whether faculty and staff needed more training to recognize warning signs. Some argued that the privacy of adult students made early intervention nearly impossible. Others insisted that there had to be ways to help before tragedies like this happened. Rebecca started a support group for families of missing people in the region. It's her way of transforming pain into something that can help others. When someone goes missing, she explains at monthly meetings, you're caught between grief and hope. You can't bury them because they might be alive, but you also can't live normally because they might be in danger or suffering. It's a specific kind of torment that only people who've been through it truly understand. The group has become a space where families can share without judgment, where they can express anger, guilt, and confusion without others trying to fix or minimize them. Right there, behind the words, there are people suffering. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because when you really stop to think about everything that happened to Daniel Carter, when you absorb the magnitude of this mystery, you realize that this case represents something deeply disturbing about the nature of human communication and how fragile our ability to understand each other is, even when we leave our words permanently recorded on paper. Daniel Carter left his last words not in a voicemail that could be misinterpreted due to poor audio quality, not in rush text that could be explained by a typo or autocorrect. He left a comprehensive diary, pages and pages of carefully documented thoughts, a direct window into his mind in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. And yet, despite all this documentation, despite all these preserved words, we are no closer to understanding what truly happened to him than we would be if he had simply vanished without leaving anything behind. They're already here. 3 words that can mean everything or nothing. The transformation of these simple words into a permanent enigma illustrates something fundamental about language and meaning. Because words don't exist in a vacuum. They depend on shared context, on mutual understanding between writer and reader, on a consensual reality that all participants in the communication recognize. But when context is missing, when the writer's reality may be fundamentally different from the reader's, words lose their ability to convey clear meaning. Was it a warning? This interpretation suggests that Daniel was trying to document a real threat that was materializing, that he knew he might not have another opportunity to record it, and that these 3 words were a concise way of communicating immediate danger. In this reading, the entire diary is a courageous attempt to create a trail of evidence in case something happened to him. They're already here, would then be a final cry of warning before being permanently silenced. It's an interpretation that honors Daniel's rationality, that takes his concerns seriously, and that suggests he was right about being in danger. But if it was a warning against whom or what? And why was no one else able to identify the threat Daniel perceived so clearly? The frustration of this interpretation is that it requires believing that Daniel was extraordinarily perceptive, capable of detecting danger that literally everyone around him, including professional researchers with decades of experience, failed to see. It's certainly possible, but it requires a considerable leap of faith. Or was it a cry for help? Perhaps they're already here was Daniel's desperate attempt to communicate that he needed help, that he was in a situation he couldn't escape alone, that he was appealing to whoever found the diary to understand that he was in danger and needed intervention. In this interpretation, the phrase carries the weight of urgency, of desperation, of a last-ditch attempt to reach help when all other avenues had failed or seemed compromised. The impact of this reading is particularly painful because it suggests that Daniel was conscious enough to know he needed help, but for some reason, whether fear, confusion, or distrust of those who could help him, he was unable to call for help in a way that others would understand and respond appropriately. It's like watching someone sink and scream for help, but the scream is distorted and no one realizes the urgency until it's too late. Or was it simply someone's mind losing its grip on paranoia? This is perhaps the saddest interpretation, but also possibly the most accurate, that they're already here was a manifestation of persecutory delusion reaching its peak. The moment when the alternate reality Daniel had constructed in his mind became so dominant that he genuinely believed the imaginary persecutors were no longer just watching from afar, but had arrived, were present, and posed an immediate threat. The mindset of someone experiencing severe psychosis can make it impossible to distinguish between real and imagined threats. The terror Daniel felt when he wrote those words was genuine, regardless of whether or not it corresponded to objective danger. He was suffering, terrified, convinced that something terrible was about to happen. And in this interpretation, what happened next was a tragedy of untreated mental health, not a criminal conspiracy. The decisions we make about which interpretation to accept reveal more about ourselves than about what actually happened. People with a tendency to trust systems and authorities tend to accept the mental health crisis interpretation. People with skepticism toward institutions and histories of experiences where legitimate concerns were dismissed as paranoia tend to believe Daniel could have been right. We all filter evidence through our own biases and experiences. The hidden truth is that we may never know with absolute certainty which interpretation is correct. And perhaps the most honest answer is to acknowledge that we don't know, that we can't know. That ambiguity is a permanent feature of this case. The diary exists as a physical artifact. The words are preserved there and can be read and reread endlessly. But the definitive meaning of those words disappeared with Daniel that November day. The journey of trying to understand this case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about perception and reality, about how we distinguish between justified and pathological fear, about when we should take someone's concerns literally and when we should acknowledge that they need medical help, about our responsibility to each other to pay attention when someone is clearly suffering, even if we don't fully understand why. The behind-the-scenes look at this case reveals that there are no easy answers to any of these questions. Even experienced professionals disagree on interpretations. Even with access to all available evidence, experts reach different conclusions. And perhaps this is the most important revelation, that the human mind and human experience are complex enough that we can't always reduce everything to simple, definitive explanations. Daniel Carter was a brilliant young man with a promising future. He was a beloved son, an admired brother, a loyal friend. He had dreams and plans and potential. And somewhere during those weeks documented in the diary, something shifted. His perception of reality shifted in a way that separated him from everyone around him. And then he disappeared, leaving behind only words that raise more questions than they provide answers. The diary remains as a testament to her final, documented journey. Pages that began with completely normal thoughts and ended with absolute terror. A gradual, inexorable transformation from clarity to confusion, from security to fear, from presence to absence. And in the end, those three words written with a shaky hand, words that carry a weight of meaning we will never be able to fully unpack. They're already here, remains a phrase that haunts everyone familiar with this case. Not because it's particularly complex or poetic, but because it represents the chasm between intention and comprehension, between expression and understanding, between being present and being understood. Daniel tried to communicate something urgent and important in that final moment. But what it was, and whether it corresponded to something real or imagined, may forever remain a mystery. Comment there, the words remain, but he was gone. And so, you've made it to the end. This means that Daniel Carter's story touched you in some way, that the mystery of those final three words intrigued you as much as it intrigued me. And look, if you felt this connection, if you were absorbed by this case that defies simple explanation, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Every day I bring you real cases like this. Stories that make you question the line between reality and perception, that treat missing people with the seriousness and humanity they deserve. It's the kind of content that goes beyond sensationalism and truly delves into human mystery behind disappearances. And if you've truly stuck with me this far on this journey, leave a comment saying, I read his words. I read every comment. And that interaction is what transforms the space into something more than just videos. It's what creates a community of people who care about these unsolved mysteries. Please leave a like, too, because it helps this video reach more people who also want to know Daniel's story, who also want to ensure that cases like this are not forgotten. Every like makes a real difference in keeping this work alive. And look, there's a video here about Sarah Miller, another case of cryptic messages that preceded a disappearance. Click there and stay with me, because her story will leave you with even more questions about how communication can fail in the most critical moments. Thanks for the company, and until the next mystery.